Jake Carter's joints creaked like old starship hulls as he clambered out of his rickety spacecraft. The days of navigating the great black ocean between the stars were long behind him, but his hands still remembered the feel of a wrench, the whisper of plasma arcs, and the hum of thrusters firing in sync. Now, the only hum was the wind slipping through the cracks of his small home, nestled in the barren ridges of a forgotten frontier planet. Tonight, though, the wind carried more than just dust, it carried whispers. Rumors of an auction, deep in the underbelly of the trade outpost, where souls were traded like parts in a scrapyard. Jake wasn't one to meddle, but something gnawed at him. The kind of gnawing that came when you've spent too long with your ghosts, and they start whispering back. He found himself at the auction, standing among the dregs of the galaxy. The place stank of desperation and rot, the air thick with the scent of spilled oil and unwashed bodies. The auctioneer, a greasy man with a voice like rusted metal, announced each lot with a flourish that barely masked the ugliness of the transactions. Jake kept to the shadows, his eyes narrowed under the brim of his worn cap, until he saw them, 3 alien girls, huddled together, eyes wide with fear. Their skin glimmered faintly, a telltale sign of advanced genetics, the kind only a few species in the galaxy possessed. Their wrists were bound with glowing restraints, but it wasn't the restraints that held them in place. It was the terror in their eyes, the silent plea for help that cut through the noise and the stink and the filth. Jake's heart twisted in a way he hadn't felt in years. His hand went to his credits pouch, a motion so instinctive it surprised even him. He hadn't come here to buy anything, especially not trouble, but the idea of leaving them in this place turned his stomach. Sold! The auctioneer shouted, and Jake's credits disappeared as quickly as the hope in the girl's eyes was replaced by confusion and, just maybe, a flicker of something else. Relief, perhaps. Jake moved fast, not giving the crowd a chance to question why an old man had just spent his savings on 3 terrified alien girls. He bundled them into his battered speeder, their delicate forms making his old, dented machine feel like a warship ferrying precious cargo. The ride back to his place was silent, the girls too scared to speak, Jake too angry at himself to know what to say. Back at his home, Jake tried to free them, but the restraints wouldn't budge. It wasn't until one of the girls spoke, her voice trembling, that he realized the truth. "We're bonded to you," she whispered, her alien accent thick with fear. "You can't free us. Because we are bound by blood and code. We are yours now, until death or the stars burn out." Jake stared at her, the weight of her words sinking in. He hadn't just bought their freedom, he'd bought their fate. And, like it or not, his own had just become tangled with theirs. The wind howled outside, a storm brewing in the distance, but the real storm was just beginning to gather in Jake's small, worn-down home. Jake Carter stared at the 3 alien girls huddled in the corner of his dimly lit home. Their luminous eyes reflected the faint glow of the fire, casting strange shadows across the rough-hewn walls. The truth of their situation hung in the air like a specter, too impossible to believe, yet too real to ignore. "We're bonded to you," the eldest girl had said, her voice a melody tinged with fear. The words echoed in Jake's mind as he paced the room, trying to make sense of what he'd done. He hadn't just bought their freedom, he'd shackled them to himself, linked by an ancient ritual more binding than any physical chain. "What does it mean?" he finally asked, his voice gruff, but gentler than he intended. He could see the youngest girl trembling, her wide eyes darting between him and her sisters. She was barely more than a child, her skin a soft, iridescent blue, shimmering like a deep ocean under starlight. "It means we can't leave," the middle sister answered, her tone resigned, as if explaining a simple fact. "Our people. Our kind. We are engineered to bond with those who claim us. For life. If we're separated, the bond will destroy us. We die." Jake felt a cold knot tighten in his chest. "I didn't know," he muttered, more to himself than to them. "I just wanted to get you out of that hellhole." "We know," the eldest said, stepping forward. She was older, perhaps in her late teens by human standards, her skin a deeper shade of violet. "We felt it. That's why the bond formed. We trust you, even if we don't fully understand why. Jake sank into his chair, rubbing his temples as if the motion could somehow dispel the weight of their words. There's got to be a way to undo it, he said, more forcefully. I'm an engineer, I've seen plenty of tech that's supposed to be foolproof, and there's always a workaround. The eldest shook her head, her expression sad. This isn't just technology, Jake. It's biology, psychology. It's in our very genes. The bond is as much a part of us as breathing. He felt a surge of anger, at the bastards who had done this to them, at the universe for its cruel twists, at himself for getting involved. But beneath the anger was a deeper, more troubling realization: these girls were now his responsibility, for better or worse. You mentioned code, Jake said, latching onto the only part of this mess that he could understand. Explain it. The eldest hesitated, then nodded. Our bond is managed by an ancient algorithm embedded in our DNA. It's designed to adapt, to protect us. And to bind us to those we trust. Jake's mind raced, already searching for loopholes, for flaws in this ancient design. So, if it's code, it can be hacked, he murmured. There has to be a way to override it, or at least alter it. The girls exchanged glances, a spark of hope flickering in their eyes. But the hope was tempered by the grim reality that they knew better than Jake. Maybe, the eldest said softly. But if you try and fail, it could kill us. Jake's hands clenched into fists. I won't let that happen, he vowed, the fire in his voice rekindling a spirit he thought long dead. We'll figure this out together. I promise you that. The wind outside howled louder, as if echoing the storm brewing within Jake's heart. He had no idea how to fix this, but he knew one thing for certain: he wouldn't abandon them. Not now, not ever. The night was still, the kind of stillness that only comes before a storm. Inside Jake Carter's home, the air was thick with tension. The alien girls sat close together, their eyes darting between the windows and Jake, who was frantically adjusting a holographic display on his workbench. Outside, the only sound was the distant hum of engines, growing louder with each passing minute. They're coming, the eldest girl whispered, her voice tinged with fear. Her violet skin had darkened to a deep indigo, a sign Jake had come to recognize as her anxiety growing. Jake grunted in acknowledgement, his fingers flying over the controls. The old rogue AI, a friend from his days in the Outer Rim, flickered to life on the screen, its voice crackling through the ancient comm system. Jake, you've got about 5 minutes before they're at your doorstep. You sure about this plan? No, Jake admitted, his tone grim. But it's the only shot we've got. The AI let out a digital sigh. You've always been a stubborn old fool. Just make sure you don't get yourself killed. You've got more than just your life on the line this time. Jake cut the connection, focusing on the makeshift defense grid he'd rigged around the house. It wasn't much, just a few automated turrets and a couple of energy barriers he'd scavenged over the years, but it would have to do. He glanced at the girls, their faces pale in the low light. Listen to me, Jake said, his voice rough but steady. When this starts, I need you to stay out of sight. No matter what happens, don't come out until I say so. Got it? The girls nodded, though the youngest one, the little blue-skinned girl, looked like she might cry. Jake's heart twisted at the sight, but he pushed the feeling down. There was no room for hesitation now. A sudden crash outside shattered the stillness. Jake's pulse quickened as he heard heavy footsteps approaching. The corporation's agents had arrived, and they weren't wasting any time. The front door shuddered under the force of a powerful blow. Stay back. Jake barked, grabbing his old plasma rifle. He hadn't used it in years, but his hands remembered the weight, the way the trigger gave just a little before it fired. The door exploded inward, and the first agent charged in, clad in sleek black armor, eyes hidden behind a reflective visor. Jake squeezed the trigger, and a burst of blue energy slammed into the agent's chest, sending him crashing to the ground. More agents poured in, but Jake was ready. The turrets whirred to life, spitting fire and plasma, cutting down the intruders as they tried to storm the house. The energy barriers flared, deflecting incoming shots, but Jake knew they wouldn't hold for long. Amid the chaos, the eldest girl stepped forward, her eyes glowing with a fierce light. "Jake, we can help," she insisted, her voice cutting through the noise. "Our abilities, no," Jake shouted, taking down another agent. "It's too dangerous." But before he could stop her, the girl raised her hands, and the air around her shimmered. The agents froze, their movements sluggish as if caught in a temporal distortion. The other girls joined in, their powers combining to create a vortex of energy that crackled with raw, untamed power. Jake watched in awe as the agents were lifted off their feet, their weapons ripped from their hands. The eldest girl's face was a mask of concentration, her body trembling with the effort to control the power surging through her. The youngest girl cried out, her energy spiraling out of control, and Jake's heart skipped a beat. "Focus!" Jake shouted, his voice cutting through the haze of power. "Hold on. Just a little longer." The rogue AI's voice crackled through the calm again. "Jake, now's your chance. The system's ready, activate it." Jake didn't hesitate. He slammed his hand down on the control panel, and a pulse of energy shot out from the house, knocking the agents unconscious and short-circuiting their equipment. The girls collapsed to the floor, exhausted but alive. Silence fell, broken only by the girls' ragged breathing in the hum of the powered-down defenses. Jake dropped his rifle and rushed to their side, his heart pounding with relief. "You did it," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You saved us all." The eldest girl looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mix of exhaustion and triumph. "No, Jake," she said softly. "We saved each other." The dawn crept over the horizon, casting long shadows across the scorched earth surrounding Jake Carter's home. The wreckage of the night's battle lay strewn around like the remnants of a bad dream, twisted metal and shattered armor glinting in the soft morning light. But inside the small, weathered house, there was a quiet peace, a calm after the storm. Jake sat at the old wooden table, staring at the steaming cup of synth coffee in his hands. The warmth seeped into his fingers, grounding him, but his mind was elsewhere, on the three alien girls resting in the next room, and on the impossible bond that had been forged between them. The eldest girl emerged from the room, her steps tentative but steady. Her violet skin was pale, her face drawn with exhaustion, yet her eyes held a new strength. She approached Jake and sat across from him, the silence between them comfortable, almost companionable. "We can't stay here," she said after a moment, her voice soft but resolute. Jake nodded, his gaze fixed on the rising sun outside. "I know," he replied, his voice gruff. "The corporation will be back, and next time, they'll send more than just a few agents." The girl's eyes flickered with unease, but she quickly masked it. "We have to leave. Find a place where they can't track us. Where we can figure out what comes next." Jake took a deep breath, the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. He had spent so many years alone, drifting from one corner of the galaxy to another, never letting anyone get too close. But now, everything had changed. The girls had become his family in a way he hadn't thought possible, and the bond they shared, while still a mystery, was something he couldn't walk away from. "There's a ship," Jake said finally, his voice steady with determination. "Old, but it'll fly. We can retrofit it, make it space-worthy again. Head for the outer rim, maybe beyond. Somewhere the corporation's reach doesn't extend." The girl nodded, relief washing over her face. "We'll need supplies, and a way to stay off the grid," she added, her tone practical. She was young, but the events of the last few days had forced her to grow up fast. Jake leaned back in his chair, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "You sound like you've been doing this all your life." She smiled back, a rare, fleeting expression that softened her features. "I've had a good teacher." The other two girls appeared in the doorway, drawn by the quiet conversation. The youngest, the little blue-skinned girl, approached Jake hesitantly, her wide eyes still holding a trace of fear, but also something else. "Trust, are we going to be okay?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake's heart ached at the vulnerability in her question. He reached out, gently ruffling her hair, and gave her the most reassuring smile he could muster. "Yeah, kiddo. We're going to be okay. We've got each other, and that's all we need." The words hung in the air, a promise as much to himself as to them. He had no idea what lay ahead, whether they would find safety or if they would spend their lives running from a faceless enemy. But for the first time in a long time, Jake felt a sense of purpose, a reason to keep going. They spent the day gathering what they could, loading the supplies onto the old ship Jake had kept buried under tarps and dust. It wasn't much to look at, but it had good bones, and with some work, it would fly again. By dusk, they were ready. As the ship's engines roared to life, Jake took one last look at the place that had been his sanctuary and his prison. The girls stood beside him, their expressions a mix of anticipation and uncertainty. "Ready?" he asked, his voice carrying over the hum of the engines. The eldest girl nodded, her hand resting on the control panel. "Ready." Together, they ascended into the night sky, leaving the past behind and venturing into the unknown. The stars stretched out before them, a vast, uncharted expanse filled with danger and possibility. But they weren't afraid, they had each other. And that was enough.